In 2013, I co-authored a book with Matt McKay and Ralph Metzner. This little book here, it's called Why, What Your Life is Telling You About Who You Are and Why You're Here. And so I've taken a reading from that book for this morning to lead into the homily. It's from chapter 9 in the book, which talks about what your values tell you about your life purpose. It's in two sections. Firstly, differentiating values from ideals, and then the notion of mission. Mission is moving from values to ideals. There is a subtle but very important difference between values and ideals. Cultures of all kinds, whether they be religions, nations, or families, aver that they are guided by ideals, the highest aspirations such as love, peace, harmony, the golden rule. But their behavior frequently belies that assertion. Religions engage in inquisitions, nations engage in conquests, and families engage in vendettas. So what actually drives their behavior are their values. For example, being orthodox in the case of religions, being powerful in the case of nations, and getting even in the case of families. So we frequently find that the values of power, privilege, and wealth, and so on, trump the ideals of love, peace, and harmony. Therefore, you must learn to distinguish between the ideals you've heard espoused and the values you've seen exemplified in your culture. Let's expand on this very important difference. In 1776, the US founding fathers created an inspiring document that stated, as an ideal, that all men are created equal. But in fact, they lived in, or even promoted, a society whose values enslaved black men, regarded women and children as mere chattels, and called the native population in that same august document savages. American history, gratefully, is the record of those values slowly morphing into the ideals set forth by the founding fathers. The very significant decline in violence over the course of human history, in wars, genocides, torture, and slavery, and in abuse of women, children, and animals, is evidence of the steady progress from values to ideals. But this evolution is more fitful than smooth. It is more like the punctuated equilibria of Stephen Jay Gould than the gradualism of Darwin. Because once a significant advance has been achieved, cultures tend to render it divine, and eventually the forward momentum stagnates in the fixation on tradition. Cultural conservatism tries to herd us tightly under the bell curve, punishing the laggards as lawbreakers and the prophets as troublemakers. But eventually, yesterday's lawbreakers will reach the place where the prophets used to stand. By then, of course, the prophets will have moved further ahead. This is the journey from mere values to soul-filled ideals. In the second section of that chapter, the mission then is moving from values to ideals. Initially, it is charismatic figures like the Buddha, Jesus, Jefferson, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. who point out the discrepancies between ideals and values, and who then offer us a roadmap to connect them. Our species-wide mission is to move humanity from a life based on values to a life based on ideals. And the individual purpose dovetails seamlessly with that by taking one or two virtues of the species-wide transformation and making them a personal mission. When we sign up for Earth Mission, we agree to push the evolutionary process forward by finding a niche, a personal mission. You put your shoulder to one of the wheels of the mud-stuck wagon and help it to lurch forward. The Promised Land is the full alignment of the ideals and the values of the entire species. The Holy Grail is the full alignment of the ideals and values of the individual. Typically, you have, consciously or unconsciously, allowed values to decide your journey up to now. You need to be able to tell values and ideals apart and then determine if you want to bring them into alignment. Let's use the metaphor of a car ride to represent your life's journey. It is the movement of your hands on the steering wheel, your behavior, that determines the route your car is going to take. Ideals are the hand movements that will take you to your stated destination. But values are the movements that will take you to your intended destination. If your ideals and values are aligned, the stated destination and the intended destination will be the same. If they are unaligned, then values and the intended destination will win out over ideals and the stated destination. As Native American tradition says, there is a difference between talking the talk and walking the walk. Ideals are like talking the talk. Values are like walking the walk. If you are aligned, then you walk the talk. So values are the basic GPS system of our actions. They provide an accurate map of how we are likely to behave in any given situation. And this can be a healthy or an unhealthy course. So it is important to examine your values. Moving steadily in the wrong direction will take you further from your stated destination than standing still will. Your values will point you towards the mission you agreed to before you incarnated, but only if you are awake and aligned. Your unique configuration of values will direct your choices and shape your goals in the service of your mission if you're awake, and in the service of seek pleasure, avoid pain agenda if you're asleep. To summarize, behavior, meaning your thoughts, words, and deeds, is how you actually perform in the world. It is the raw data of your living. Your ideals, on the other hand, are how you would be if your behavior were in alignment with your highest aspirations. And your values are the actual determinants of your behavior. Aligning your values with your ideals, then, is a sine qua non of finding your mission. Words inspired by God. So last week, I read my mission statement and the responses of the COJ community after the meetings on February 20th. And I spoke about 4 main points in response, trying to unpack my mission statement and answer some of the questions raised by the community. So last week, I answered the question, what has changed that we need to change our mission statement? And then I answered a question about the trifurcation point in human history, dealing with Homo artificialis, Homo spiritualis, and Homo sociopathicus. Thirdly, I asked the question, is community about affirmation or is it about challenge? Then fourthly, I addressed the question of creating a vision for yourself. Now, today I want to continue and deal with some of the other major parts of the mission statement and the responses to it. And to start off, it was a big document that got many questions, 22 different questions. So I can only give one-liner responses to some of the questions and then deal at length with some others. So I'll deal at length today with the notion of ideals versus values, as I mentioned in this reading. And I talk about the question of politics. I was asked to address politics and the accusation that I was too political. And then I want to look at the notion of loving kindness and the feminine face of God. So they're the main points I'll go through. But firstly, I want to give just one-liner responses to some of the other questions. And this is not done in any kind of a dismissive fashion. This is done because I don't have time to cover everything. And this is the work of the community to answer these questions. So I'll read out 5 of the most important one-liner questions and then offer a quick comment and then hand it over to you to work with. Question number 2 asked, what amount of personal freedom do I have in relation to the mission statement? And my answer is, as much as you always had. Question number 3 was, what do I do if my personal cosmology feels at odds with the cosmology laid out in the mission statement? My response is, follow your own cosmology. But it has to be an informed cosmology. In Catholic theology, there's a huge difference between conscience and informed conscience. Some people say I'm acting according to my conscience, but it is not a very well-informed conscience. So it has to be an informed conscience by which you're making your choices. And so what do you do when you feel at odds with the mission statement? You follow your own cosmology, but you make sure that your cosmology is an informed, well-researched, meditated upon cosmology as you follow it. The 4th question was, what is the spiritual lens through which to view politics? my one-liner response, and I'll talk about it much more later. What is the spiritual lens? That of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Mandela, and Jesus. Question number 6 asked me, how do we recognize and oppose oligarchy and its mission to seek to oppress others, recognizing that oligarchy is present at all levels of society, not just at the very top? And a one-line response, by research, by looking at the track record, particularly of the mass media, and find out when you've been duped in the past so you won't be duped in the future. And question number 8 was, the mission statement includes these words: we will speak out on behalf of any group anywhere on the planet whose rights are being threatened. How do we define these rights and determine whether or not they're being threatened? And the one-liner response is by waking up and educating ourselves. And these are not flippant responses. This is the work of individuals. It is the work of small groups in our community, and it is the work of the community itself. Waking up, educating ourselves, making sure you've got a personal cosmology, which is based on information and research and prayer and meditation, and then moving forward as an individual, as a small group within the community, and as COJ. So they're just one-liner responses to some very important questions. I'm going to pick up now on some of kind of the larger issues. And so this book that we wrote in 2013, this was a very important chapter, distinguishing between ideals and values, because for many people, these are synonyms. And for me, they represent the same difference between a vision and a personal cosmology. And so as you wrestle with the notion of your ideals versus your values, you have to wrestle with the notion of your vision for COJ versus your personal cosmology. So that's what I want to get into for a few minutes right now. So your function, when I say you, I mean every single individual, and I mean all small groups within our community, and I mean the community itself. Your function is to use this mission statement as a template to forge your own personal cosmology and your own vision. I'm not expecting that you're going to swallow this hook, line, and sinker and say, you'll go lockstep, this is Sean's vision, everybody has to get in line and goose step. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that this is a template, maybe to help you to fashion your own vision of what COJ looks like, and therefore your personal cosmology, being careful to distinguish between ideals and values. And I articulate that more. So in some senses, the ideals are like your personal mission statement, and the values are your personal cosmology. So there's always going to be a trade-off between your ideals and your values, between your mission statement for COJ and your personal cosmology as a member or a small group of COJ. And when you look at, personal cosmology, I spent a lot of time over the years talking about the importance of creating a personal cosmology for every one of you. And I've suggested that the skeleton of every great personal cosmology is the answer to 4 questions. The first question, who is God for me? Is God a distant, demanding deity, or is God a loving, doting grandmother? Secondly, who am I? When I say I, what do I mean? Do I mean a skin-encapsulated ego? Do I mean my physical form? Do I mean my emotions, my ideals, my profession? Or do I mean my God self, my source self, or my soul self? That's the second great question. The third one is, who is my neighbor? Is my neighbor just simply the person who thinks as I think or lives next door to me? Or is my neighbor all sentient being? What is your answer to that? And then the fourth question is, what is my mission? What did I volunteer to do when I said, yes, Lord, send me? So personal cosmology will be built around the skeleton of those 4 questions. And if you take 2 of those questions, who am I and who is my neighbor, then you're talking about politics. Politics is the art of self-government. That's my own definition of it. It is the art of any community's self-government. And so when there are more than 2 or 3 are gathered together, there has to be politics. There has to be an agreed sense of self-government by the little community, even if it's only a community of a single family. So I have emphasized again and again and again that your personal cosmology, it must constantly be updated. You can't just, stay with the cosmology that you learned, from the Baltimore Catechism when you were in grade school. You must constantly update your personal cosmology. Your personal cosmology must be able to make sense of your own very unique experiences in life. Nobody else has lived the life that you're living right now. And if your personal cosmology can't accommodate all of your unique experiences of life, it's not serving you anymore. You cannot borrow a cosmology from anybody else. You can use a template and say, here are some good ideas, here are things that work for me, here are things that don't work for me, but I'm going to work at creating one that can make sense of all my own unique experiences of life. Your personal cosmology must make your heart sing. If your personal cosmology is that you're going to go to hell for all eternity for eating sausage on a Friday, you have the wrong cosmology. If your cosmology is not making your heart sing, then it's not the right cosmology for you. You need to work some more on it. And the role of your personal cosmology is to stretch you beyond your mere role self in this incarnation into your soul self, the part, the eternal part of you that said to God, send me, I will go down, I will try to shift the entire planet into a Christ consciousness. And I've preached this again and again and again and again and again. And I've included it in many of my books. And as I say, I devoted an entire chapter to it in this little book called Why. So it becomes really, really important to differentiate between your values and your ideals. I use the image of driving a car. Your hands are on the wheel. You have a stated destination. I want to become a kind, loving person. I want to contribute to Christ consciousness. That's your stated, ideal. But your intended ideal is the compromises you're going to make with life and with the situations you find yourself in. So your car is not going to go to your stated destination. It's going to go to your intended destination, because your movements on the wheel, your behavior, your thoughts, your words and actions are actually going to take you where your values are taking you, not where your ideals are taking you. So it becomes really, really important to spend quality time to differentiate between these. Because the surest way of trying to figure out what is my mission, I get asked this question again and again and again and again. How do I know what I came here to do? And I can tell you very simply in a single statement. It is to examine your ideals and then examine your values. And your mission is to shrink the distance between your ideals and your values. As an individual person, as a family, as a little group, as a community, as COJ, or as planet Earth. So that's what I mean by ideals and values, a vision statement, and a personal cosmology. One of the big questions that has come up over the last several months, and in the responses of the community during the meeting of February 20th, was the accusation that I'm far too political. So I had to devote a part of this to the difference between politics and partisan party politics. They're radically different. I lived in Kenya between 1972 and 1986, and in some senses, it was the happiest time of my entire life. Those 14 years, I loved being in Africa. I loved the culture. I loved the people. I loved the friendliness, the resilience, the sense of humor that I found there. But I also found that, like in Ireland and like in the United States of America and every place else, the people are beautiful, loving, kind, humorous, and the politicians suck. Mostly the politicians suck. So between 1984 and 1986, my last 2 years, I was stationed in a very remote area, a little village called Kipsarman, which literally means the place of the twins. And it was right on the edge of the Baringo Desert. And it was subject to fairly regular kinds of famines. And in 1984 and 85 particularly, there was a very serious famine in the area. And I had 19 villages in my parish at the time. And so through a contact I had in Nairobi, once a month, I got 3 lorry loads of food delivered to the mission. And I brought in the leaders of all the villages, and I said to them, we're not just going to give out this food. We're going to make sure that people, do something useful for their community in order to earn this food. So have every village pick out a project that they want to work on, and people are going to volunteer for it. And at the end of the week, every Saturday, come up to the mission, and there is somebody in charge of your village, and they'll decide how much food goes to which persons. So we ran that for several months. And there were some really great projects happening, and people were being fed. And then I heard through the grapevine that a local politician who was an assistant minister in the government, the equivalent of like an undersecretary of state in the United States. And this guy was using government troops to take the food from his own people, his own tribe, and he was selling it. And so he and I clashed furiously at public meetings, went on for several months. And at one stage, they sent a Land Rover with troops from Cabernet, which was about a 2-hour journey away on a dirt road, up to Kipsarman to arrest me. And the young men of the village got to hear of it. They always know ahead of time. And they put boulders across the road. And they stopped the convoy. And the guys got out and said, "What are you doing?" And the young man said, "We are welcoming you to Kipsarman." And the guys were speaking in Kalenjin, and they said, "You have a very loud bell in Kipsarman, but it will shortly lose its tongue." And they turned around and drove back to Cabernet. Some time later, I woke up one morning and I had an old man, Isaac, who cooked for me every day. And Isaac wasn't there. He was normally there about 6 o'clock in the morning. So I went around looking for him. I asked somebody, "Have you seen Isaac?" And they said, "Yes, he's been arrested. He's up at the schoolhouse." So I get into my truck. I had a Toyota Land Cruiser 4-wheel drive truck. And I drive up there and I find there's about 30 men squatting on the ground in front of the school building. And there are soldiers there, askaris with rifles. And there's a chief with a kiboko. Now, a kiboko is a whip which is made out of hippopotamus hide. The word in Swahili for hippopotamus is kiboko. And it's a whip made out of hippopotamus hide. And he's wielding this thing, and the soldiers standing with guns, and all the 30 men are squatting. And I asked what the problem is. And I'm told that these men were being arrested because they had not contributed to the Harambee. Now, a Harambee is a beautiful system that was set up after Kenya's independence. It literally means self-help. And it was a system whereby if a village or a town wanted to develop a particular project, they'd hold a big Harambee, a meeting, a self-help meeting, and then invite an important personage, frequently a politician, to raise money. And they'd auction off stuff. So one family would contribute a goat, another a sheep, another one, a chicken, somebody else, a dozen eggs or whatever, and they'd auction these off in order to raise money for the project. But at some stage, it turned into forced contributions, particularly if there was an important personage, you couldn't insult him by raising a little bit of money. So on this occasion, the president of the country, who was from the area I lived in, Daniel Toraita Charap Moi, was holding a big Harambee away at the western side of Kenya, hundreds of miles away from where we lived. But the provincial commissioners were told, you need to raise X number of Kenya shillings and submit them so the president looks good. And then the provincial commissioner called in his district commissioners, maybe 10 or 10, and said, you need to collect X amount of Kenya shillings to present to the president. And then the district commissioner called in the chiefs and said, you need to collect this amount of money from the villages in your location. And what happened was they came out and they started stealing sheep and goats and stuff from the families, and they arrested men who resisted. And all these guys are squatting on the ground with the askaris with rifles on them, and the chief with his kiboko. And so I challenged the chief in front of everybody, and I tell him that the Harambee was a self-help mechanism of voluntary donations, and it was totally against the law. And I personally would set out to meet the president, Daniel Toraita Charap Moi, because he was coming to the area to address a big rally a few weeks down the road. I turned to the guys who were squatting and said, I'm going back to the mission. If anybody wants to climb aboard my truck, come on now. And the men look at the askaris with the rifles, and the askaris look at the chief, and the chief looks at me, and I wave the guys on, and they all run and climb aboard the truck, and we head off. Now, the question I asked then, was that a political action? Damn right, it was a political action. Was it party politics? It had nothing got to do with party politics. I could never vote in Kenya because I was a resident alien. I didn't have permission to vote. So I could not get involved in party politics, nor did I ever want to. I've never in my life been a member of a political party, not in Ireland, not in Africa, and not in the United States of America. But there's a huge big difference between politics and partisan party politics. Politics, my definition is, politics is the art of a community's self-government, whether that's COJ, or whether it's a family system, or whether it's a national system, whatever it is, it's a community self-governing. And my personal heroes, people like Jesus Christ and the Buddha, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, were all political in the sense of spirituality in action, but never in the sense of partisan party politics. And so I make no apology for using the words like freedom or censorship or human rights. Way back in 2011, at one stage, after Mass in Palo Alto, a woman approached me and said, you've been skirting around a lot of kinds of issues. Why don't you tell us what you really think? And I said, if I tell you what I really think, you'll throw me out of CIJ. And she said, why don't you give it a shot? So the next Sunday, I gave a homily I called How Our World Works. And I looked at 18 different facets of life on our planet, everything from agriculture to finances, to religion, to military industrial complex, to the pharmaceutical industry. And I gave a homily, a 45-minute homily, as a result of which we created the first exploration group. And every month for the next 18 months, I gave a lecture on one of these areas. And then during the week, we broke up into small groups to research them in much more depth. Now, was that a political exercise? You bet your bottom dollar it was a political exercise. Did it have anything to do with party politics? Not a whit. Had nothing got to do with party politics. It didn't matter to me who was in control. All I know was these were issues that affected day-to-day living for ordinary people. So I won't be changing my style as I go forward. I will continue to try to create an 80-20 split between talking about mystical spirituality and then practical, political, everyday problems that you have to deal with. It's my belief system that any spiritual leader who attempts to be apolitical soon becomes irrelevant, because you can't help those who live in the trenches created by the politics of everyday life if you just reside in the heavens nonstop. You can't be a spiritual leader and be apolitical. Finally, I want to look at, there was a question asked, the question was, where do love, kindness, and the divine feminine fit into the mission statement? And that's a very important question. And so I'm going to take it in the spirit of that this was a real search for finding that those messages in the mission statement. Where do we find, where is love, kindness, and the feminine face of God mentioned in my mission statement? And the first thing you have to say is, this is a single-page document. It is not a 400-page theological treatise. And therefore, I can't go into everything. So you have to learn how to unpack that as you would perhaps a parable of Jesus, a small, pithy little saying out of which you need to try to feed yourself. So let me help tease this apart a little bit. Where is love in this mission statement of mine? In the very first paragraph, I mentioned the notion of Christ consciousness. We are here to develop Christ consciousness. What's another word or phrase for Christ consciousness? It is love personified. So if you want to know, is there love mentioned in the document? It's in the very first paragraph. It's called Christ consciousness. Having that same mindset in you that was also in Christ Jesus, as Paul put it so powerfully in his letter to the Philippians. Where is there kindness in the document? Freedom, human rights, and concern for the oppressed is kindness in action. It's not kindness as in some kind of a mental notion about being nice to people. It's about kindness in action. It's about walking the talk. Where do we find the feminine face of God mentioned in this document? I said in the very second chapter as well, that part of our spiritual practice is spending time regularly in nature. Nature is the feminine face of God, whose loving and whose kindness builds us literally from our own body, molecule by molecule. Every single atom of your physical body has been gifted to you by Gaia, which is the feminine face of God, writ large as our very planetary system. This feminine face of God that we call Gaia is the one that feeds us daily from our own body. Everything you put into your body is produced by your mother, by the feminine face of God that we call Gaia. Every home you live in and every piece of clothing you wear has come from Gaia, from our mother, from the feminine face of God. So where is the feminine face of God mentioned in the document? It is mentioned about going out and spending time in nature and learning from nature, which is the single greatest teacher anybody ever has. You want a guru? Go outside and look at nature. Where is this feminine face of God mentioned? In the very second paragraph of the mission statement, I talk about the importance of Eucharist for our community. For me, Eucharist is the sacramental global symbol of what I call Christa Consciousness. There's Christ consciousness in the sense of the male version of God, and there's Christa Consciousness, which is the feminine articulation of the same source energy. So I've spoken to you many times about the extraordinary symbol that Christ left us at the Last Supper that we call the Eucharist. Because of all the symbols he could have left as his final gift to us, he chose this intensely feminine symbol. The Eucharist is the feminine face of God symbolized ritualistically in a Mass encounter. And so in some senses, Christ, our Christa consciousness, is conceiving us, is birthing us from our own body and blood. Literally, Christ fed us with his own body and blood, representing that Christa consciousness, the feminine face of God, literally is feeding us during Eucharist from our own body and blood. Then she feeds, having conceived us and carried us and birthed us within her own body, she now feeds us at her own breast, from her own, literally from her own body and her own blood. And moreover, the Eucharist, in some senses, in the Eucharist, it blends our divine and human natures in an act of transcendent time travel. I've spoken to this many, many, many times. When you understand Eucharist, Eucharist is not a memorial of an event that happened in a small room in Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago. Eucharist, properly understood, is a transcendent time travel in which you can participate as fully in the encounter as did Mary, or Peter, or Judas, for that matter. It blends both our human and our divine natures, and that's the symbolism during Mass, where the priest is going to take water and pour it into the wine. The water represents our human nature, and the wine represents our divine nature. And we're mingling together in order to participate in the transcendence of God, the feminine face of God. So those are the ways in which we recognize, be grateful for, and dedicate ourselves to imitating the love, the kindness, and the feminine face of God in our mission statement. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.